Last Friday, Sarah Tisdall was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment for leaking a confidential Foreign Office memorandum to the Guardian newspaper. Tonight, in an exclusive interview, she says why she did it. We also identify for the first time former civil servant Ian Wilmore. He leaked a secret minute of a conversation between a judge and a civil servant. And Norman Nail, who as a civil servant leaked confidential information about a fraudulent insurance firm. To some of the public, leakers like this are whistleblowers and heroes. To the government machine, they're hidden traitors. In October last year, Sarah Tisdall was working in the private office of Sir Geoffrey Howe, Foreign Secretary, in the Foreign Office building in Whitehall. Across the road is the Ministry of Defence. On October the 20th, Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine sent a private memorandum to Mrs. Thatcher, the Prime Minister, in Downing Street. A copy of the memo went to Sir Geoffrey at the Foreign Office, where Sarah Tisdall worked. The memo disclosed that cruise missiles might arrive in Britain on November the 1st. It discussed how this should be presented to Parliament. Mr. Heseltine wrote that if the missiles had not arrived on November the 1st, he would answer questions in the House concerning them and say they hadn't come. If they had arrived, the plan would be different. I propose, he wrote, instead to make a statement to the House after questions. There'd be a press conference and then perhaps a photographic facility at Greenham Common itself. The aim, he admitted frankly, was presentational, to concentrate as much attention as possible on the government position before the opposition and the peace movement had an opportunity to react. In the Foreign Office, Sarah Tisdall had access to some of Sir Geoffrey's correspondence. A clerical officer on £6,000 a year, she had been positively vetted for access to secrets, and she had passed a further Foreign Office security test. It was her job to photocopy confidential correspondence. She read the Heseltine memorandum.
Well, I felt that it was immoral and that a Secretary of State for Defence who was accountable to Parliament had decided he wasn't going to be accountable to Parliament on that particular day, the day that the cruise missiles arrived. He was going to wait until after they were here, and at the end of his allotted question time, tell the House that they were here, and then get up and leave before the opposition had time to react in the House, and go off to Greenham to have his photograph taken.
He was going to evade proper parliamentary scrutiny.
Yes, he was.
Her decision was swift. She ran off a spare photocopy and put it, with another confidential memo, in an envelope addressed to the political editor of The Guardian. She then walked on her own up Farringdon Road and gave it in anonymously at the newspaper's offices. Why did you take it to The Guardian particularly?
Because there was nowhere else to take it. The Guardian is a paper I read most of the time. I sometimes read the Times as well. I find the Times and the Telegraph quite right-wing, and the Guardian is really the only left-of-centre, middle-of-the-road type sort of newspaper that comes out of Fleet Street that has national coverage.
Would it be fair to say that it's the only paper likely to put the same construction on this memo as you put on it?
Yes.
You wanted a favourable hearing for your views?
Yes, of course I did.
Why did you take it in person? Wasn't that a bit risky?
Yes, it was a bit risky, but I took it round on the evening of the 21st of October, and I was aware that there was a big CND march planned for the next morning, and to have the full impact, that memo needed to be published in the paper on the Saturday morning.
Do you have views not only on ministers' proper scrutiny by Parliament, but also on matters concerning Britain's nuclear armament?
Yes, I do.
What are they?
My business.
The Guardian published a story in time for the march and later the text of the memo itself. Then, in a dramatic court case, the Guardian was made to hand back the actual photocopy they had received. Today, most photocopiers can be identified by tiny markings on the machine's drums, much as typewriters and guns can. Sarah Tisdall explains what happened.
The internal investigation then knew from which photocopier the document concerned had come. Fortunately, a lot of people use that photocopier, myself included.
But tracing the photocopier was only the first step.
Then they handed things over to the police, and then things really started hotting up, and we were all fingerprinted. and then we were all, one by one, taken for questioning at Scotland Yard. They asked me views on my political opinions, and they asked me questions about what I had done on that evening and what I had done at work during that day.
Did you feel they were getting fairly close to home?
Yes.
The probing Yard interview on Friday, January the 6th was a turning point.
I made the decision that on the Monday morning I would go in and give myself up to the police, because at that stage I still hadn't told my parents and the rest of my family what I had done. So I told them over the weekend, which wasn't a pleasant thing to have to do, and then I went into the police on the Monday morning.
What were the major factors in determining you to go to the police?
One, that things were obviously hotting up, and I didn't really want to be dragged out of bed at 4 o'clock one morning by a burly great policeman. I didn't want my parents to find out what I had done through the police. It was best that I'd tell them. And I didn't want my colleagues to have to go through what I'd had to go through that Friday afternoon.
At Sarah Tisdall's trial, a picture emerged of an unpolitical woman who had inexplicably acted out of character. But in an interview filmed before the hearing, she showed she has strong views on current issues and was not afraid to act on them. Did you discuss giving this material to The Guardian with anybody else before you did it?
No.
Did you act partly out of political disenchantment with the present government?
Yes, I did.
What was the nature of that disenchantment?
I felt that I'd been let down as a voter, that the policies that were being implemented both in my work situation and outside my work situation were having a detrimental effect. I mean, the cuts in health, the cuts in education, and spending large amounts of money on weapons we don't necessarily need.
Miss Tisdall told police she thought Britain required nuclear weapons, but should have absolute control over crews. Also, she told us, government economies were affecting conditions of work at the Foreign Office.
I was having to work longer hours, my colleagues were having to work longer hours. The diplomatic service is having to cover more posts with less people. And when the results of that happening, lack of consular care, lack of commercial facilities, bounces back, is always the Foreign Office's fault. The Foreign Office has got it wrong again. Not the Foreign Office has got it wrong again because it's not being given the money to have all the people necessary to do a proper job.
So you were being pushed hard for no very real objective?
Yes. Other than just it's not cost effective.
What do you feel about the Guardian's action in handing back the memo to the government?
I still don't think that they should have handed it back. But that's a personal opinion because it resulted in my arrest.
What do you think the Guardian should have done?
Well, I think they should have broken the law. Now, that's a fairly hairy thing to say on television. I think they should have destroyed the document and then have told the government that they had destroyed the document sometime previously.
What do you feel about the possibility of going to prison?
It is a possibility. I think it would be rather absurd to send me to prison for leaking that document, which is meant to be a state secret. It was a party political document, essentially. I don't feel I damaged national security in any great way by releasing that document. I feel I could cope with prison. Wouldn't be easy, but you just have to grin and bear it.
Today, the customary trickle of leaks has become a torrent, and personal delivery is common. Last year, a civil servant from the Department of Health and Social Security brought a letter concerning a fraud investigator's guide in person to CHAR, a pressure group for the homeless. He was glimpsed leaving the building. More recently, there have been leaks on vetting of civil servants at the Ministry of Defence, leaks on drug pricing, defence costs, and even alleged leaks of the budget. And the government's hitting back hard. Police are now being called in on most leak inquiries. These exclusive pictures show officers from the Serious Crime Squad raiding the premises of Greenpeace, the ecological pressure group, last month. This time the leak was about nuclear waste dumping. But not all the disclosures come from the glamour areas of defence, the Foreign Office and nuclear power. Last year, Ian Wilmore was working in the Department of Employment. At 25, he had the plum job of administrative trainee, a possible permanent secretary of the future. Like Sarah Tisdall, he saw a document he didn't like and threw his career away. When you went out that day, what was your objective?
I was going to photocopy a document which I thought was of serious public concern, which showed that a senior judge had secretly interfered in politics.
The document dealt with a conversation between Sir John Donaldson, Master of the Rolls, and Mr. Michael Quinlan, Permanent Secretary Designate in the Department of Employment. What did you do next?
I gave the photocopy to Time Out magazine, intending that they should publish it as widely as possible.
Is that against the law?
Yes.
Time Out did publish. For The Guardian, it was front-page news. Why then did a high-flying civil servant break the law? Ian Wilmore comes from an establishment background. He was a public schoolboy, and he read philosophy and theology here at Oriel College, Oxford. But politics and the way Britain is run were also a major interest. He and a group of friends worked hard for Labour.
I would describe myself as being on the centre-left of the Labour Party. I voted for Kinnock in the Labour leadership election and Roy Hattersley as deputy leader. That was the centre ticket, I suppose. When I was at Oxford University, I was chair of the University Labour Club. I was active in the National Organisation of Labour Students. Since I left university, I've held various positions in local Labour parties.
Wilmore joined the civil service in London, partly to get close to the centre of political power.
I suppose I thought I could put up with decisions or attitudes that I might not like in the interests of finding out the way that the system worked.
Why did you leak the confidential minutes of the Donaldson meeting?
Lord Donaldson was suggesting a radical change to the framework of law which governs industrial relations in this country, which would have had an important effect on the balance of power between unions and employers.
Surely a judge is a free citizen. He's entitled to have and express political opinions.
A judge is entitled, and indeed inevitably will have, political views. What he's not entitled to do is to use the opportunity afforded by his office to attempt to secure political results in private by meetings with government.
Wilmore was soon disillusioned with the civil service. He found the gap between the Thatcher government's public statements and the confidential material he was able to see too big to stomach. He offered his resignation, citing political differences. He was then questioned about the leak. Unlike Sarah Tisdall, he was offered immunity from prosecution. He then confessed in writing that he was responsible. Do you accept that you breached a position of trust?
I gave an undertaking when I went into the civil service not to leak documents, and I broke that undertaking. However, I considered breaking it was justified because of the public interest in this particular case. I also hope that the experience of this particular case will contribute to pressure for more open government, which I think is a political essential.
Today, Ian Wilmore is out of the civil service, but his case and that of Sarah Tisdall raised general issues about the morality of leaking. We talked to a man with strong views on the subject. Do you think the unauthorised disclosure of official information is ever acceptable?
I mean, my answer to that is never. And anybody who leaked anything in my own organisation, I would never have had the slightest degree of mercy on, as far as I personally was concerned. If you are employed and paid by, which you are, by this particular organisation, if you betray the trust, you are corrupt and you ought to get out.
Supposing the particular organisation is breaking the law or breaking the Constitution?
You get out and you can do almost everything you could possibly think of to expose that in public.
Why should you sacrifice your career when it is the organisation that has made the error?
Because you haven't got a career.
If you are not discovered, you will have.
And that you have to live with the rest of your life. And I wouldn't like to live with that, would you?
Many people we have met have leaked and are happy to have leaked.
Well, I wouldn't want to know them, quite frankly.
Today, the climate for moles is hostile, but occasionally they can be tempted up above ground. We talked to a man still serving in the Welsh office. He could not be interviewed, and we've taken steps to conceal his identity. But he admitted he had leaked a letter from Dennis Thatcher, the Prime Minister's husband, to the Secretary for Wales, Nicholas Edwards. I did it, he said, mainly because I saw it as undue interference by a British Prime Minister's husband in Welsh office affairs. There had been a great outcry, but they had not pinned the leak on him. Would he do it again? If a similar attempt was made to influence the civil service, yes. 10 Downing Street has rejected the suggestion of any impropriety by Mr. Thatcher. One civil servant has over many years thought through the ethics of leaking. Norman Nail is now retired, but in 1966 he was working in an office of the Board of Trade near Westminster Abbey. He now tells for the first time a remarkable story. His job dealt with the vetting of car insurance companies. Among these was Fire Auto Marine, or FAM, run by the exotic Dr. Emil Savundra. Dr. Savundra attracted Mr. Nail's suspicions.
I went over to another part of the Department of Trade, and they kept a series of files on international financiers in order to warn British exporters if they were falling into the hands of some international twister of some sort. And I then discovered that they had an enormous file on Savundra. There was a large amount of information on previous large-scale fraudulent activities in which Savundra was one of the principal operators.
For Norman Nail, the next port of call was obvious.
I had contacts with the press, and I gave them some of the background of FAM's financial position, and I gave them some of the background of what sort of chap Savundra was and what his background was.
Nail agrees that the information he gave the newspapers was confidential.
I was, in fact, disclosing information which came to me as part of my job as supervising insurance business. And the basis on which I was doing this was that I was making a judgment, I don't hide that, I was making a judgment about what was in the public interest in view of the fact what I was supposed to be doing was a sort of consumer protection. I was supposed to be protecting the public from bad insurers.
Nail argues that the Act offering protection against car insurance fraudsters moved too slowly. By the time civil servants could warn the public, the con men had got away. A key principle behind the Act, he says, was that the fear of public exposure would deter insurance swindlers. All his disclosures were doing was putting the spirit of the Act into practice. One key disclosure was to the Insight team of the Sunday Times.
I did, in fact, give them the list of companies in whom Savundra claimed he had invested his funds, and he showed on his accounts an enormous amount of reserve, I think $500,000 or something like that. And then when he was asked to substantiate this, and I did this under my powers that I could ask him to do that, he then produced a list of firms in whom he claimed this money was invested, and it was that which I gave to the Sunday Times. Because,
John Barry was at the time on the Insight team. 18 years after the story broke, he and Nail discussed the scandal in the Sunday Times offices. Barry confirmed the significance of the share certificates.
The most important thing that Norman told Insight about Savundra was the numbers of the share certificates, which constituted what he alleged were the reserves of Fire Auto Marine. If those share certificates were genuine, then Fire Auto Marine was quite rich. If they were fake, it was bust. And Norman didn't have the resources, as we understood it at the time, to investigate those numbers for himself. And so he gave us the numbers and said, you might like to go and find out.
their investigators were able to follow this up. They went individually to each of the companies whose shares he claimed to own, and it turned out that these were entirely forged share certificates, that he didn't own anything. The $500,000 didn't exist as assets.
After supplying the share certificate numbers, Nail gave further help in person.
And I agreed to come along on a Saturday and sit in at the Sunday Times at the compiling of the article, which I did. And I think it was, there were several revisions of it as a result of my reading it through and suggestions I made and so on.
Nail's disclosures produced results.
Norman's leak to us accomplished two things. First, it caused a political scandal. So a deeply reluctant Labour government had to take action to reform the insurance industry. And then, when they were planning the reform, it was Norman who wrote the reforms. He drafted, with his colleague at the time, the section of the 67 Companies Act which was spatchcocked in at the last minute to handle insurance companies. So he created the fuss, and then he cleared up the mess. It was a remarkable achievement.
Norman Nail said that conscience and public duty lay behind his actions. Sir Frank Cooper.
If someone leaks out of motives of conscience or political beliefs, isn't that different from leaking, for example, for gain?
In a philosophical sense, yes, but in absolute terms, no. They are both morally wrong.
But one's much less morally wrong than the other.
Obviously, if you're doing it some kind of financial gain, I think I personally would say that was worse than doing it out of conscience. But whichever way you do it, it's fundamentally wrong. Of that I have got no doubt whatsoever.
Wilmore, Tisdall and Nail were all junior civil servants when they leaked, but it's well known there are leakers among top people too. They include senior public servants and cabinet ministers.
Ministers, to use the current phrase, leak like mad when they want to test the water, when they want to outmaneuver some other force, perhaps another minister or perhaps the opposition, but some other political group. And I think ministers leak like mad in those cases.
The services are particularly prone to leak when cuts threaten expensive projects. In 1980, secret documents about defence cuts were leaked to the Press Association. They caused a public uproar. And we've been told privately that senior military men will still go to the newspapers to fight cuts in their budgets. We've heard a blanket condemnation of all kinds of leaker. But how do the stern critics react when the leakers are high-ranking service chiefs? Sir Frank Cooper on the position of senior officers.
They are aware that, a particular part of their service or a particular weapons program or something to which they're attacked is under some kind of threat. And I certainly think they do let it be known that they're concerned about this and worried about it.
In plain language, that's a leak.
No, I don't think it is a leak, because a leak is a deliberate betrayal of a specific piece of information.
But a government plan is a piece of information.
No, I think we're talking really about government intentions or possibilities. And there are fine distinctions here.
Very fine indeed.
They are very fine. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But a leak is something where you get a piece of paper or a known decision deliberately communicated. That is thieving. Now, I think what you will get where there is something like a defence review in progress, people will say, well, aren't destroyers or strike aircraft or tanks terribly important? And here are 5 arguments as to why we ought to go on with them.
What kind of things are in those arguments?
Oh, all kinds of things. History.
Current performance?
Current performance, which is mostly public if you like to look at. And there's an amazing amount.
Mostly, but not entirely.
I would say nearly almost totally entirely, if you've got the time to sit down and look for the information and put it together.
You're saying they never disclose new facts, just marshal old ones?
Never is a strong word, but most of the time, no. I mean, occasionally they will, yes.
For whatever reason, there's no recent record of anyone high up the ladder being punished for leaking. This week, a lower-level victim of the government's current campaign has time to ponder these strange discrepancies. Sarah Tisdall starts a 6-month sentence specifically designed to deter others. But governments have tried before to keep the lid on secrets that are embarrassing to them. And so far, the threat of prison has not deterred men and women from making disclosures which they believe to be in the public interest.